Welcome to the fifth in our series of Becoming America, a conversation and a study on the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Our goal is to inspire, to inform, to educate, and yes, even entertain as we talk about the men who wrote the Constitution and the issues that faced them over 200 years ago. With me are my co-hosts, the Honorable Bijan Kian and Judge Jim Gray, and also Dr. William Barclay Allen, a professor, a political scientist, a brilliant man, and you'll hear a lot more about him in just a few minutes. We begin each one of our sessions with a song from the new musical called Convention, written by Stephen Lawless, Joel Henry Stein, and our good friend, Judge Jim Gray. The Convention is a musical. It's about the birth of America and the Constitution, and that's the entertainment part of our program. So, Jim, today the program is the song is about us expanding rights in this country because we didn't begin with all of the same rights. So tell us about the song we're going to hear this morning.
Well, thank you, Joellen. It's called What About Me? And I'm really proud of this. We begin with the delegates being very proud of themselves and kind of puffing, saying, oh, freedom was what we long for and brotherhood is what we give and the rest. And they go through this and then there's a pause and there's a slave. He says, well, what about me? You know, you build all of this on my back, but we have no freedom. How can you be free if we're not free? What about me? And then you go to the women, because there's all groups of people that were left behind. Women, well, fine, but we have no reason to rejoice. We can't vote. We can't get an education. We can't travel. What about me? And then naturally, of course, as well, Native Americans. We welcomed you into our forest, and this the thanks that come, and you leave us just the crumbs. What about me? You soil your destiny, it ends with, which is, there's an argument to be made for that. Then we have a blacksmith, the working class, and here they take them to task as well. And I wish I could say I wrote all of these lyrics, but we quote what was going on in the newspapers. There was criticism of the landed class, the aristocracy that were making this Constitution. And they ended up saying, well, you're the well-bred, well-fed, well-read, well-wed, which is all true and has pretty much has a ring to it. And then, we know you've got the system rigged. So I bleed, I'm deed, and I'm bleed while you just powder your wigs. So what about me? And then I am proud to say that this is as much as I could do with my musical talents. So I handed it to Steve Lawless, our partner in writing this, and said, Steve, make it great. And he blended it all together. All of the end was Steve Lawless. I think is one of the best songs I've ever heard. We don't dwell on these problems yet. We'll talk about, of course, as Dr. Allen, I'll be taking notes when Dr. Allen talks about not only the Constitution, but what has happened thereafter with regard to all of these issues. I think it's one of the best songs I've ever heard, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So let's listen to What About Me?
Freedom is what we strive for, brotherhood is what we give, freedom is what we'll die for, that is how we want to live. Liberty will unite us, participation one and all, no one will dare to fight us, government by rule of law. Our thoughts belong to no one else, our wages are our own, no taxes paid without a voice, we keep the crops we've grown, 'cause freedom is what we strive for, brotherhood is what we give, freedom is what we'll die for, that is how we want to live, our liberty will unite us, participation one and all, no one will dare to fight us, government by rule of law. We spread our freedoms to the west, no foundations built on sand, our destiny is manifest, prevail o'er all the land. 'Cause freedom is what we strive for, brotherhood is what we give, freedom is what we'll die for, that is how we want to live, our liberty will unite us, participation one and all, no one will dare to fight us, government by rule of law. But what about me? What about me?
can see me. How can you talk of brotherhood with justice as your call, while we are slaves in bondage? Your loftiness is so small. Not one word about our plight, you're hypocrites one and all. You build your fortunes on our backs, you rise because we fall. So, what about me? What about me? They don't even hear me. Your nobleness a powder puff, your virtue is a lie. You use our children and our wives, our only comfort comes when we die. To you we count just 3/5 of a man, in body and in soul. But we laugh and we bleed just the same as you. We're not 3/5, we are whole. So what about
me? Powerless, empty, no land and no voice, just cleaning and cooking and sewing. Give me a reason why I should rejoice. Makes me wonder just where this is going. All of this talk about brotherhood and striving for some great new dawn. And it's not like we're not into motherhood, but there's other stuff out there. Come on! How about voting just like you men? For that we need good education. And after we study and cook and then sew, I think we could use a vacation. Listen to your old pal Jefferson, who told you that women's equality would not be a threat to true gentlemen. At least not gentlemen of high quality. So how about it? What about
me? We welcome you into our forest, this the thanks that comes. Disease, starvation, then you force us to survive off just the crumbs. Our ancestors weep when they see this land you devastate. The beaver, deer, and bear you kill so you can propagate. There's a better spirit that you refuse to see. You squander for your selfish selves. You soil your destiny.
You are all the aristocrats, it's only you who have the vote. We till the soil while you get fat, but our ideas no one will note. We fight your wars and make your nails and build your lofty mansions, but government is yours instead to plot your next expansion. Well-bred, well-fed, well-read, well-wed, why you always meet in secrecy? Well, I sweat, I fret, I'm in debt, and I get not the slightest taste of decency. You're the ones who bought up all the land. Maybe you could lend a helping hand. You know we fought and died for freedom too. Would that be too much to ask of you? Oh yeah, that's right, not you, 'cause you're the well-bred, well-fed, well-read, well-wed. You know, I know you've got the system rigged, but I bleed, I breed, and I plead while you just powder your wig. So what about me?
powerless, empty, no land and no voice, just cooking and cleaning and sewing?
You wanna
Give me a reason why I should rejoice. Makes me wonder just where this is going.
we struggle to survive for wasted empty lives? about
Freedom is what we strive for. Brotherhood is what they give, and freedom is what we'll die for. That is how we want to live. Strive for freedom is what we die for. Freedom is what we cry for. Let us oh, freedom is what we strive for. Brotherhood is what we give. Freedom is what we'll die for. That is how we want to live. Freedom is what we strive for. Brotherhood is what we give. Freedom is what we'll die for.
If they don't,
Freedom is what we'll die for.
what about me?
That is how we want to live.
Most of the songs in convention are lively, they're fun, they're historical. So is this one, except I might take the fun part out of it because this really exposes the part of American history that does not show us at our best, but we are getting better. But these are subjects that we cannot and should not ignore. We need to look at them. One of the themes of this program all the way through is that America is the perfect idea, but the United States is a work in progress. In other words, we haven't always lived up to our own aspirations, but we try, and we're getting better at it all the time. And I think there's no one better to discuss this particular topic with us today than Dr. William Barclay Allen. He's got an incredible history. If I gave you his whole background and listed all the articles and books he's written, we wouldn't have time to have the discussion. So I'll give the abbreviated version. He's a professor of political science at Michigan State University and also the former dean of the James Madison College at Michigan State. He has served as the visiting scholar at the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good at Villanova University, been a member of the National Council of Humanities. He's an expert, and I think this is extremely important for our purposes, an expert in liberal arts education, its history, its purpose, importance, as well as its problems. He's the chairman and co-founder of an organization called Toward a Fair Michigan. And their mission is to further understanding of equal opportunity issues and guaranteeing civil rights for all citizens. It provides a forum for fair and open exchange of views on the question of affirmative action and other issues pertaining to a fair and equal treatment. He's published extensively. George Washington, The Collection, George Washington, America's First Progressive. That's an interesting title. He's written a commentary on the Federalist Papers, the essential anti-Federalist. So he's looked at the Constitution from both points of view. And he's written either dozens of other articles or books that have been published in many journals. He's fluent in French and competent in about a half a dozen other languages. He had the Fulbright Advanced Teaching Fellow in France, has published works on Montesquieu, which our founding fathers relied heavily on. He's also, and this is, I think, really important for our purposes, he's the Anne and Herbert Vaughan Visiting Fellow at the James Madison Program on American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's also the past chairman and member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. And so, Dr. Allen, we welcome you. We're delighted to have you with us today, and we know that we will learn a lot. As our drafters of the Constitution put in the preamble, they wanted to create a more perfect union. That is a better union than existed under the Articles of Confederation. But they were also focused on liberty, both the founders as well as the anti-federalists. Liberty was very important for them, but not necessarily for all. As the song said, women, slaves, Native Americans, in some cases, people who didn't own property, in some cases, people who favored the wrong religion. So the delegates discussed who should vote, but these qualities didn't necessarily come up in those discussions. Did the founders trust the people? How did they look at various categories of the people?
Thank you very much for that, and I apologize for that telephone ringing, but it will cease presently. Let me say, first of all, after that introduction, Joellen, I'm tempted to think that people will expect me to be speaking to them from my family plot. However, I appreciate very much that you tried to convey what the substance of my work has been for over 50 years now, because it has been centrally focused on the questions that you're concerned with in this very important project. And it includes having myself also created a drama on the Constitutional Convention. During the years of the bicentennial of the Constitutional Convention, we produced a radio drama setting forth this entire thing in dramatic form, including reference to the specific questions that are on the agenda today. So that for me, this is a question that I have been very carefully focused on. And one of the things I want to convey immediately, and I know you have lots of questions, so I'm not going to speak at great length, and we'll still have a conversation. I hope you will indulge me in that manner. But I will say this at the outset. I think there is a pervading misconstruction about what the framers actually thought and did. And it is conveyed partially by the song, What About Me? We see an instance of this in 1932 when the writer, Mr. Du Bois, wrote a play about the founding, an important little play, one I use in my teaching. And he surveys those questions. And the most interesting thing about the play, however, is not his relating the tales of exclusion, but his relating the struggles over dealing with the implications of the principles from the Declaration of Independence, starting with the war and the question of whether to introduce slaves or free blacks into the military that was fighting the revolution. And while he is critical of George Washington there, and mistakenly so, he nevertheless also grudgingly concedes what Washington effectively accomplishes, which is to say, it was the first integrated force in the American military. It didn't happen in 1948. It happened in the Revolutionary War itself, which means that the picture was always a two-sided picture. It was not just a picture of exclusion. It was a picture of dealing with the tensions inherent. And those tensions are reflected when Gouverneur Morris in the convention is holding forth at great length about the importance of private property and why that is the foundation of the Constitution and of civil society, until he's reminded that slaves were property. And then he changes his mind. He says, well, no, we don't go that far. We don't mean that. So there were, how shall we say, there were tensions in the breast of the framers themselves. It is not just that you had a bifurcated society with people who were indifferent to others. People who wrote the Constitution, people who lived the revolution were perfectly aware of these difficulties and resolved somehow to try to overcome them. The legislature in New Jersey, even before we get to the Constitutional Convention, is declaiming to the rest of the country, look, we can't form our militia on the basis of population and ignore the fact that a large part of the population of the southern states in particular are slaves. That has two injustices embedded in it. One, if we only count the free whites, their proportion of those who must defend liberty will be disproportionately small in terms of the overall population in those states. So we must count the slaves for that reason, in our own interest, but also because the Declaration tells us they're human beings. That's what they said, both things in the legislature of New Jersey in 1777. So from that whole period, from the Declaration through the Constitutional Convention, people were focused on this issue. They were not oblivious to it. That's what I want to underscore. It's really important. Otherwise, we won't understand the significance of Washington freeing his slaves in his will. We won't understand the significance in 1786 of George Washington giving public testimony that he wished to see slavery abolished, but that it had to be done legislatively through the rule of law, in a legitimate process, and not simply by tyrannical imposition of one part of the society upon the other. And it is also the case that we can find numerous examples, including Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church, which is to say, who testified himself about the importance of the Constitution, the Revolution, and the promise it held. So we have a rich picture rather than a one-sided picture of the founding period. And when it comes to the Bill of Rights, it is clear that they in themselves give us reason to be comforted by the prospects envisioned, not just the materials of the Constitution, the provisions of the Constitution, but the expectations that derive from including such provisions ultimately in the adopted Constitution, though after the fact, as we all know. So what I'm going to say is we have a rich picture, a picture that includes a 3/5 clause, to be sure, a 3/5 clause widely misunderstood, misquoted by Colin Powell, by Condoleezza Rice, by Secretary Albright, by even my own daughter, who is a very brilliant and very famous person, but even she relates the mistaken view that it meant that the founders thought Black people were only 3/5 human. It didn't mean that at all. It's not what they said. It is a misconstruction that pervades us to this day and therefore harms us in trying to understand what actually took place. The original 3/5 clause was drafted in 1783 and specifically refers to free Black people not as 3/5, but like all other free persons. The language is edited slightly in 1787, but only to perfect the language, not to change the principles. They understood when they said 3/5, they were speaking of a legal relationship and not a quota of humanity. And unless we see that that's what they were doing, we will misrepresent them. And what is the consequence of misrepresenting the founders? We mislead ourselves. We begin to put on, we begin to become penitentes. We're beating ourselves, beating bloody strips across our backs for something that didn't happen in the way we imagined it to have happened. So to me, it's really important to go back through these things one by one, clarify them, and come to a real understanding of what the framers were trying to do.
Would you go back
Dr.
and
Allen,
explain?
I'm sorry, Dr. Allen, Dr. Chatham and Judge Gray called me the American. I'm the most eager student in the class. So I want to ask a question specifically about qualifications for voting. Does the Constitution address qualifications for voting? Would you please address that?
The Constitution does so, we know, in Article 1 in a very specific way. It defers to the decisions in the states regarding the most popular branch of the state legislature. Those are the qualifications for voting in federal elections, which meant, of course, it was wide open. If you ask yourself the question a different way, why did the Constitution not specify that women could not vote? Because that was not their design. Why did it not specify that Blacks could not vote? Because that was not their design. And guess what? During that era, there were some states in which both Blacks and women voted. Now, yes, it was rescinded subsequently in New Jersey because we go through social developments over time and opinions change and people alter their relations. But the Constitution was wide open. It excluded no one on the basis of religion, no one on the basis of gender, no one on the basis of race. It deferred to the states, which implies it knows there's a work to be done. Dr. Chatham said at the outset, America was a work, the United States was a work in progress. It was a work in progress in the conception of the framers from the beginning. They understood the people had to work themselves into what the principles would ordain for them. It could not just be happen by flipping a switch. So the consequence is the Constitution is wide open. No one is excluded. It is a mistake to say anyone was ever excluded by the Constitution. The practices of the society had to evolve to fit the suit tailored in the Constitution.
Dr. Allen, and thank you for that, because you were saying that you should take each state one by one, which is an approach that we don't hear very often, and I certainly subscribe to it. And in my research to come up with Convention, the Birth of America, I found out, and I'd never heard this before, that there was a slave woman named Mum Bet who in 1781, that's 6 years before the Constitutional Convention, brought a lawsuit based on the Massachusetts Constitution, saying it is unconstitutional under our state constitution for me to be enslaved. And she had a one-day jury trial and prevailed. And then another slave brought another action within that year. And these are things that we don't focus on. Is my information correct? Is that true?
The information is correct, and it has a wider historical context. You will be familiar with the Somerset case in England. That was the first case of the similar character, where someone who had been a slave had been taken to England and brought a suit for liberty. And the courts in England decided that this minute you step on English soil, you are a free person. You cannot be a slave. That became the model which was then subsequently followed in the United States. You never saw the Somerset ruling adopted in the United States expressly, but the pattern was being followed in the Bett case, and there were similar challenges. Now, it is the case that what we saw happening in the war, because just remember 1781, we still haven't gotten to Yorktown yet by the time this has happened, and we certainly haven't gotten to 1783 and the Treaty of Paris. But one of the things that transpired in the war is that slaves would escape to the lines of the British and then enter board British ships, which were treated like British soil as far as the British were concerned. And so they fell under the ruling of the Somerset case, at least in the eyes of the British government. But in the negotiation for the Treaty of Paris, the Americans insisted upon either return of the slaves or compensation for the slaves. So that you have going on at the same time these individual pursuits of liberty and these arguments about the property interest of the slave owners. Both were happening at the same time. And they eventuate by the time of the 1795, when we get the Jay Treaty, that it is resolved by George Washington of all people in the form of not requiring John Jay to execute that provision of the 1783 treaty, which required compensation for the slaves. The main reason you had strident opposition to the Jay Treaty was because the Washington administration failed to deliver on that promise to either pay for or return the slaves. But Washington, through Hamilton, published an argument that it would have been immoral and unjust to do so. On both religious and moral terms, it would not be right. So throughout the whole period, you have a struggle over the question about slavery, liberty, and justice. It was never a settled question. That's what has to be underscored. But it was a question that was on the table and was being consistently argued and developed right through 1808, when we finally passed, of course, the legislation prohibiting the slave trade in accord with the promise of the Constitution. So look at the whole period, go state by state, and understand it is a dynamic environment, not a static environment. And if I have nothing else I can leave with a clear understanding of what happened, that would be what I would underscore. It was a dynamic environment in which the principles of liberty were squarely placed on the table and which people therefore had to work their way through their implications.
The convention, they discussed having a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. There were some who ardently wanted a Bill of Rights. Hamilton, Madison, and others said, no, we don't need a Bill of Rights. What happened? What was that discussion all about? And why did Madison ended up writing the Bill of Rights, and yet he originally opposed a Bill of Rights.
Yes, this is another area in which it requires sensitive understanding to grapple with, which we need to go all the way back to 1628 and the Petition of Right, as it was posed to Charles I in Britain, because that is the prototype of the Bill of Rights. What is the Bill of Rights? It is a contract between the people and a sovereign. The monarch was sovereign, and the effort in a Bill of Rights was to restrict sovereignty, to restrain the government, to place through contract limits on what the government could do to the people. That's what the Bill of Rights is supposed to do. So it's no surprise when James Wilson, among those others who said we don't need a Bill of Rights, explained to us, here the people are sovereign. They can't make a contract with themselves. They can't restrain themselves. It's not a monarch separated from the people to be restrained. What we're doing, they argued, Hamilton, Madison, Wilson, and all the rest, is we're so limiting government that there is no scope for government to enter into such a contract with the people, because the government is not supreme, the people are. That distinction was important in their minds. We've lost that. We have, in fact, let us confess it, we've fallen into the pattern, the old world pattern of thinking the government supreme. And therefore that we have no ability to do anything except when permitted by the government. So we need contracts with the government to be permitted to do something. That is not what was understood at the founding. They were trying to overturn that very paradigm. Hence, they argued the Constitution is itself a Bill of Rights. It is the contract that the people enter into among themselves and establish a government which cannot override their authority. But there was an opposition. And we understand why there was an opposition, because all the state governments that were formed before the Constitution was formed began with a Bill of Rights. They had struggled, they had the Petition of Rights before them as a model. They thought we needed to declare in a Bill of Rights our principles, our foundations, before we established a structure of government. So they did so. And if you go back and read them, you will be really quite astounded at what they thought needed to go into a Bill of Rights. We think it's a list of special privileges. For them, it was far more expansive than that. And they would include things as, for example, declaring the proposition of an absolute separation of powers in government. Now, of course, not one of the state governments lived up to that, but they declared it as their goal. Why could they not live up to it? Because as they said when they drafted the Constitution in 1787, if you don't have some relation between the branches, among the branches, it won't function at all. That was a lesson they learned from Montesquieu. You have to have some interaction, some relationship, some mutual dependence to make the government work at all. So an absolute separation as an abstract principle is unworkable. So the designers of the Constitution were trying to find a workable solution to framing a government that would create the foundations for civil life without predetermining or prescribing the character of civil life. But those who wanted a Bill of Rights insisted, to the point that those who favored the Constitution realized they needed to use that as leverage to get the Constitution itself approved. And that is what happened.
And was that a wise decision in retrospect?
And now you use the word wise, and perhaps you do that wisely. But we could use the word prudent, and perhaps that would be wise also. I.e., one would say, if you cannot get the Constitution on any other grounds, then it is a prudent thing to do, to get the Constitution to launch the work that is going to be a work in progress, rather than to die stillborn and never make any political advance. You would say the same thing with respect to slavery and other issues. Should we stop this right now until we resolve that issue? Or should we get an instrument that will give us the ability over time to resolve that issue? Is it prudent to do the latter rather than to watch everything fail in the former? That's the issue.
Well, come now, Dr. Allen. You're not telling me that life is complicated, are you? You're not putting that into here.
It is the nature of human life that there are trade-offs that bedevil us at every step of the way, every step of the way.
It is one of our problems as people who live in the 21st century, is that we look back at 1787 and we try to impose our perspective, our views on them, instead of looking at the issues from the perspective that they had to look at the issues. Was that one of our problems in interpreting our Constitution?
I would say that is one of our problems, and it's a problem which is engendered by a kind of intemperance, if I say so. And I don't mean to be pejorative, but we are a fairly intemperate people, a people who want to resolve immediately their opinions into policies and laws. Now, the framers understood that you cannot have stable law unless you have a fixed constitution. But if you make the Constitution subject to changing opinions, you cannot have a fixed Constitution. So what's the trade-off? The trade-off is you put up with a great deal of disagreement, even division and polarization in the community to the extent that you have a fixed Constitution that can contain it. If you don't have a fixed Constitution, then the civil community will fracture. That diversity of opinion will destroy the possibility of any continuing political existence. So to the extent that you have fixity in the Constitution, you can tolerate a great deal more diversity in the community. And the converse is also true.
One of the Civil War amendments, there were three, one that freed the slaves, one that guaranteed the right to vote. Then the 14th Amendment, which is much longer than the other two, and includes guaranteeing due process of law and equal protection of the laws, that amendment had far more impact than merely on the rights of the former slaves. How has the 14th Amendment been used by the courts particularly to impact law and the Bill of Rights itself?
Well, let me say, particularly because it's a reference to the Bill of Rights, that then we must go back to the Bill of Rights in order to understand what happened. The Bill of Rights restrained the federal government and not the state governments. This was affirmed in 1832 in the case Barron versus Baltimore. And throughout that whole period, therefore, there was almost no resort to the Bill of Rights for the simple reason that people rarely thought the federal government posed a threat to the rights that were listed. So that it was not until you got to the 14th Amendment that the door opened. And why did that door open? Because the original Constitution actually had a rights clause in it, not part of the Bill of Rights. That was the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which said the people of the several states would enjoy the same privileges and immunities throughout the United States. That created the possibility for federal enforcement of basic rights, not allowing one state to do to other state citizens what it would not do for its own citizens, or to impose limits on other state citizens that it would not impose upon its own citizens. But that was never well clarified through judicial interpretation. There were attempts to it. Judge Bushrod Washington, among others, in Caulfield versus Coryell, don't worry about the name of the cases, he tried, initiated that process, but it was never settled. So when the 14th Amendment was adopted, it was trying to do two things. It was trying to secure the rights of the freed slaves from variation among the states, and at the same time to resolve the question of the Privileges and Immunities Clause, that it could not get resolved judicially, it wanted to do it constitutionally. But that meant then, what it was doing was establishing a foundation to impose the limits of the Bill of Rights on the states as well as the federal government, because it was essentially identifying privileges and immunities as what's listed in the Bill of Rights. That's how the two come to intersect. So then we come forward from the adoption of the Reconstruction Amendments, and it's not until 1908, essentially. I mean, we had a case before then, Yickwo versus Hopkins, but that's a separate matter, and it didn't cite the Bill of Rights or the theory of incorporation subsequently developed by the courts. It only cited the broader language under the 14th Amendment. So it's not until 1908, essentially, the court says, wait a minute, we can incorporate the whole Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment and apply them against the states to assure privileges and immunities across the United States. That began the process in the 20th century through which the Bill of Rights became the most important part of the Constitution. Most of our litigation turned on it. Most of our discussion turned on it. In fact, this was so dramatic that by the time of 1938, in the Caroline Products case, you actually have the court, only in a footnote, only in dicta, not in decision, but nevertheless, you had the court actually say, Republican institutions do not work to protect minorities. That's where you get the protected class doctrine from. And so then we began moving in a different direction. It is up to government to provide protections, not to people to protect themselves in the framework of a limited government. And then that means we make more and more appeals to the Bill of Rights, more and more appeals to the government to create special privileges for protected classes. We've begun to move completely in the inverse direction from that which was originally set out under the Constitution.
Dr. Allen, we had the Civil War, we had the 14th Amendment, we had the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and it really, in effect, didn't work, or at least didn't work substantially. We had the Jim Crow laws that were on the books. and survived, even though the 14th Amendment applied the Bill of Rights to the states. Then you go into Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and that was, okay, separate schools, but equal schools. And of course, they were separate, but they were not equal. So it was a transition. Do you agree with that? Because really, by the Warren Court in 1954, when we got to Brown versus Board of Education, where they're simply saying, nonsense, separate but equal be damned. No, we're going to integrate fully, but it's been a transition. Am I on the point?
In part, you certainly have captured the drama, but I will make I express some reservation about the overall interpretation. I would say it actually did work. And it was because the original proposition worked that you got the Jim Crow laws. It is often forgotten that before you get to the Jim Crow laws, you're going through a period of roughly 30 years as you see extraordinary progress on the part of the freed slaves, the ex-slaves. Progress educationally, economically, religiously, family. It was dramatic. Between 1860 and 1890, a period of 30 years, the 4 million slaves that existed, the 4 million Black people that existed in the United States, turned into over 8 million. That dramatic population growth in just 30 years means there's a dynamic environment, things are working well, people are actually forging lives for themselves. And it was the threat, the social threat of that success that produced the turn to Jim Crow legislation to try to check it. There's a new book just out by Robert Putnam from Harvard and Shailene Garrett. They're co-authors of this, called Upswing. And you need to look at this book because it's extremely important to correct our impression of what happened. It explains the extraordinary progress that was made up until the 1960s, when things reversed dramatically. Now, when that happened, it was the case that you would say the promises of the Constitution were being fulfilled until a lack of faithfulness in the country, in state legislatures and elsewhere, tried to upset it. So the evidence is the Constitution actually worked, not that it didn't work. The evidence is that the environment worked, but bad faith undercut it. And even then, it didn't stop dramatic progress. So the real changes came when we introduced the notion that it took government to protect the people, and government made classes of victims, and government became the source of salvation. And then from the mid-60s on, we saw extraordinary declines where we had seen great material advances previously. And you will understand this if you go back to Brown versus Board of Education and you see the most important sentence in the whole opinion rendered by Justice Warren. The most important sentence in that opinion was, freed slaves were incapable of building their lives on their own. That's what he literally said. That was the basis of his decision. But that was a lie. It was not true. But it introduced us to a whole generation of people who have only a disability concept of Black Americans. They look at every Black person as someone disabled needing to be helped. That's inconsistent with the constitutional promise.
Victimization just doesn't work. It doesn't work, and that's what a lot of ways what government is saying.
Dr. Allen, as I sit here and I absorb all this wonderful knowledge, I really can't help but asking the question from you: has the Constitution lived up to the expectations that we have in the Constitution, as the greatest document ever written by the hand of man, as has been said? Has it lived up to the expectations of helping to build a more perfect union, establish justice, secure the blessings of liberty? And how do we the people, play a role in making sure that as we revere this great document, we also do our part to contribute to that constant process of improvements towards a more perfect union? And also securing the blessings of liberty. I know you said that it's really the responsibility of the government to keep us secure, but what can we do to help make that happen?
Well, your question poses what to me is perhaps the most important element of reflection that we face. I have no difficulty answering the question. I've answered it many times previously, but one needs examples in order to give some kind of body to the answer. And the most important example is, of course, the Civil War to which Judge Gray referred. Let me remind you of what the most intelligent observer of the United States expected of the United States in the 1830s. That's Alexis de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville, in the last chapter of his first volume in Democracy in America, the chapter on the three races in the United States, gives an extremely pessimistic rendition of the future of the United States. He says, quite literally, there will be no end to the problem of the racial division in the United States, given the history of slavery, the growth of the number of slaves, and the impenetrability of the division between the Europeans and the slaves. There's no solution other than a war of racial extinction. That was his prediction. And he was a very bright man, a very wise man, but he was wrong. What did begin to change the picture? It was not a war of racial extinction, it was a brothers' war. The brothers fought each other over this question of slavery. And I know it's popular today to say the slaves freed themselves. Well, you must forget that. It's not true. Yes, there were many slaves who fought for their liberty and many slaves who passionately desired their liberty. Nobody can overestimate that. But the war, the real solution to the problem of slavery was the brothers' war. And why did the brothers fight each other over this question? Because they took to heart the principles of the founding. Enough of them did to insist upon them. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So I always say in answer to your question, what was thought at the time to be an experiment had become, by the end of that war, a proved experiment, a success. It was a success. But now ask yourself this. If it was successful, does that mean it will endure forever? No. It doesn't remove the burden from our shoulders. You ask, what should we do? From the same thing we had to do from the beginning, to be as inspired as those who fought the Brothers' War were inspired by the founding principles. We have to assume the responsibility. The Constitution is not what keeps the United States alive. The Constitution gives the people the opportunity to keep the United States alive. And so even though it has proved successful, the United States can still fail if the people fail.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Allen.
Let me ask a question very much related to that, because I think we all very much agree with what you just said. But then there's the issue of the states. And today the word states' rights is considered by some as a code word for discrimination. And it was the states, as Jim said earlier, through the Jim Crow laws that made it difficult for the former slaves to advance. And through many years where the congressional committees that handled civil rights issues were dominated by Southerners who stopped civil rights legislation. So what is the answer to the question that the states prohibited the former slaves, and then just later on, African Americans in general, from voting or participating economically fully in the society? How do we answer that question?
Well, there are two ways we answer that question. First, remember that the Southern states from the period of the beginning of the 20th century, at least from Woodrow Wilson up until the 1960s, exercised their power not alone, but in alliance, primarily with Northeastern liberals. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't just the Southern states who were responsible for that result. It was that alliance that produced that result. That is why you have in the middle of all that things like the Davis-Bacon laws, which served expressly segregationist purposes and required the cooperation of the Northeastern liberals and labor unions, as well as Southern legislators, in order to be made law and to remain law to this day, in effect. So that the picture is the picture of how partisan politics has operated in the United States. It is true, states' rights became a code word for discrimination up through the period of the civil rights movement. But when we hear today people advancing defenses of sanctuary cities or states on the basis of states' rights, or environmental distinctions or policy distinctions on the basis of states' rights, or responses to civil disorder on the basis of states' rights, you're seeing the same states' rights argument, not on the basis of a code word for discrimination, at least in name, but for quite the opposite purposes. So what does that underscore? It underscores the nature of federalism. States' rights is the tool politicians turn to when they no longer command the federal or national forum. Then they will use the opportunities that federalism grants to them to try to obstruct or redirect policy. That's what states' rights is about. So it has been previously used for discriminatory purposes. It has also been used for other purposes, and that will recur because that's one of the virtues of federalism. Let me just say one more thing about this. It is important to understand that constitutions are not policy-making instruments. Constitutions are the bases for structuring policy-making. Policy-making takes place within that structure, given the divided opinions and sentiments of the people who participate in policy-making. And what you need is a stable structure so all that division won't become destructive. Those who speak about a living constitution make one fundamental mistake. They forget what the fatal defect of life is. The fatal defect of life is mortality. If there's a living constitution, it is doomed to die, as all life is doomed to die. A fixed constitution can sustain life in a community. A living constitution cannot do that.
I hate to say that we're almost out of time. If I had my way, we would impose on you for about another half a day, but we don't have that luxury. So Bijan and Jim, do you have any last questions for Dr. Allen? And then I'd like to give him a closing comment as well.
Dr. Allen, I am gratified that you shared your wisdom, your thoughts, your experience with us, your sophistication. I look back at the Booker T. Washingtons, Frederick Douglasses of this world, and so many more, including Dr. Allen. The government belongs to us. If it isn't working, it's our fault. It's our responsibility. We need to look no further. But do you agree with us? We have the name of this show that you are our guest on today as Becoming America. The United States, or America, is a work in progress. But America is a perfect idea. It's a transition. Do you believe that we are in better shape as a country now than we were 10 years ago or 40 years ago? And compound question, do you believe that we will be a better America 10 or 40 years from now?
I wish you had not asked that question. You put me in a very difficult spot, I must say. Not 6 weeks ago, I met with a group of former students of mine over several years, gathered them together just in a kind of reunion. And these were special students. They were not my students in general through 50 years of teaching, but students from a special program where I would visit every summer and spend 2 months mentoring these very talented young rising juniors in the first year, and then for the second year, Black students from the best institutions around the country, to talk about these issues. And so I gathered them together roughly 6 or so weeks ago. And they asked me a similar question. And I had to be honest with them and to tell them that I think we have but a generation left. And that it's unfortunately falls upon their shoulders to determine whether the country is going to survive or not. And it would be dishonest of me to have told them that and not tell you that I told them that. I don't mean by saying that the Constitution is not a perfect idea. It is a perfect idea. I represented that to them. But I had to be honest and say, I do not see that we as a people still have the resources and commitment to live up to that idea. I hope that I'm wrong. I pray that I'm wrong. And I still labor to prove that that need not be so. But as an analyst, as an historian, as a philosopher, looking at all of human history, seeing us in context, I have a decreasing expectation that we're going to rise to the occasion. So I wish you hadn't asked that question. I just wish you hadn't asked that question. I didn't want to end there.
Okay, we're not.
Dr. Allen, I'm going to make it a little bit more difficult on the continuation of the thoughts by Judge Gray. That difficult question in my mind is this. We are in the year 2020, and we ask ourselves the question, with a divided America, where do we start bringing the country together? If there was one action, Dr. Allen, as a scholar, as a philosopher, seeing the problems up close, if there was a single action that we could take to bring America together, it will take some time, but what is that single action in your
about that, I can be clear. The action most necessary today is to present in the most compelling fashion manner the truth about our politics currently. The fact that I voted twice in the last election is significant, for I was not alone. Now, I don't mean when I say I voted twice that I personally committed a felony, but I mean that I voted once in my own name, and in my name, another vote was cast in another state. I know this. I've been reliably informed of this. We have seen such an extraordinary deterioration of civil engagement and practices and legal guarantees that unless we reveal with compelling clarity what is going on and how it is shot through with dishonesty, we will not give the people a chance to react to it. That to me is the single most important thing that needs to be done.
Would you agree with me to vote for Dr. William B. Allen for president in 2024? Because that's where I'm going.
Be delighted.
You know, it seems that we're talking about institutions. The Constitution is an institution, and there's been none like it. We have a Bill of Rights that doesn't give us rights. It guarantees rights that we have because we're Americans and because we're human beings. But I think if there's any one problem facing our country right now, it's not our institutions. It's who we are as people. Because one thing about human nature is it doesn't change. If we look back at the ancient Romans and Greeks and our forefathers in this country, we're all human, and human nature doesn't change. And I think our founding fathers understood human nature very well. James Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government, but we're not angels, so we need government, but government is composed of men. So we also not only need to control men, we need to control government. I think the greatest problem we have in this country right now is the lack of civic virtue. Not civic engagement, not civic involvement, not even civic knowledge, but civic virtue, where we literally live up to the golden rule, that we treat others as we want to be treated, and we live up to the values that were declared in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. So it is up to us as individuals, not to get what we want, but to literally live out the civic virtue that our founding fathers knew was essential for this government to pass on and to sustain itself. And I think that's what we're losing. Dr. Allen, would you give us your closing thoughts before we have to close out?
Yes, I'll happily do that. And I'll just take the cue from what you just said. I think it's true, and it is demonstrable in so many ways. As you know, the text from George Washington's farewell that effectively says what you just said. It says, you cannot expect without religion and morality to preserve liberty. We know that. We know also what James Madison pointed out, in his memorial and remonstrance, that we owe duties to God before we owe duties to civil society. Those obligations, which are the obligations of conscience, are not spawned by government or by society. Those obligations are obligations to God. That is the foundation of this nation. It was the freedom of conscience, more than all the other guarantees, all the other rights. The freedom of conscience is what stands at the bottom of them, and which tells us that we must control government. Why? So that we can answer to God. So what I would say is this: it is the question of the people that is the most important question. It is not the question of the Constitution. I know there are many people who want to rewrite the Constitution, call constitutional conventions, change the way things are done here or there, because they think if you just write it down someplace, it becomes effective. It's like those who in the Constitution of the state of Illinois guarantee dignity to people. Well, what use is that in a constitution? These are things, responsibilities that fall on our shoulders, and only the due exercise of which permit us to have constitutions at all. And you cannot invert that relationship. So I would say that what we must look forward to is trying to restore an understanding, a robust understanding, that our future lies in our hands, not in our tinkering with our institutions.
I cannot thank you enough on behalf of my colleagues and everyone listening. Your scholarship, your thoughtfulness, your historical perspective are something that is truly a national treasure, Dr. Allen. And I thank you so much for being with us. If there was one book that our viewers could read, what would you suggest it be?
George Washington.
Your book, George Washington.
You know, the reason I published George Washington, the collection, was because nothing strikes you more sensibly than actually reading his words. When you discover, as I did quite by accident, how profoundly intelligent he was and the direction he gave this country. That's the one thing everyone should read.
George Washington, the collection. We'll make sure we put that on our credits. And next time we're going to interview Dr. Tom Campbell. Tom is the former dean of the law school at Chapman University and has another extensive biography. We'll be talking about the judiciary and also the role of women and how the Constitution deals with women. In the meantime, if you want to listen to the songs from the musical convention, just go to judgejimgray.com and you can listen to all of the songs. And if you'd like to hear or read about a day-by-day blog on what happened at the convention, just go to Concordia University Irvine Center for Public Policy, and all of the blogs are archived there. And thank you for joining us, Dr. Allen. Again, thank you, Bijan and Jim. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dr. Allen.
Good day.